So welcome everybody to the UK Society for Cooperative Studies annual lecture. As you'll be aware, this year's lecture is a memorial lecture to the late Professor Johnston Birchall. I'm not going to say too much now because I don't want to preempt David, who will pay tribute to Johnston Birchall in his remarks. So I won't repeat those. Needless to say that I have a stack of books on my desk, all of which are authored by Johnston Birchall, which I've relied on most heavily on many an occasion. It really was a significant legacy of work that was there, and others have known him well. So I'll leave David to cover that. It's my pleasure to introduce David. He doesn't really need an introduction, but for the sake of the fact this is recorded, there'll be many more people that don't know him who are viewing this at a later date. Many will know David as a former chief exec of CDS Cooperatives and the past president of Co-op Housing International. David did lots of other work in and around the co-operative movement as well, including editing the International Co-op Alliance guidance notes and the co-op principles, which I had the benefit of engaging with David on many years ago and still use on a fairly daily basis in my work. So that was a really significant document. David obviously had lots of involvement in the wider co-op movement, including in Ealing and wider work in and around the co-op parties, stuff in co-op housing. Relevant to this, David's background as a science teacher and has described himself as having an enduring interest in the in evolution of humanity's capacity for cooperation. And I think that will feed into some of the lecture that David's going to give. So I will stop talking and I will spotlight David, and with that I will hand over.
Hello. Well, thank you, Ian, and good evening, everybody. Thank you for logging into this very important memorial lecture. It's an honour to be asked to give this annual lecture as a memorial to the memory of Dr. Johnston Birchall. I had the pleasure of knowing and working with Johnston over many years. During my tenure as Chief Exec of CDS Cooperatives, and while on the Board of Governors of the Cooperative College, and as President of Cooperative Housing International, which is the specialist organisation that represents housing cooperatives around the world. For my generation of cooperators, Johnston was the premier academic and historian of the cooperative movement. His influence on the understanding of cooperatives in the UK and globally was beyond measure. The list of Johnston's publications, which Ian has on his desk, is vast, but two in particular influenced me. The first was his seminal book, Co-op the People's Business, to which I still frequently refer. It was published in 1994 to mark the 150th anniversary of the founding of the Rochdale Equitable Pioneers Society. Chapter 2 on the philosophy of cooperation is essential reading, in my view, for all cooperators. His second publication is The Resilience of the Cooperative Business Model in Times of Crisis, which was written jointly with Lou Hammond Kettleson and published by the International Labour Organization. This report documents the strength of the cooperative movement during the global 2008-2009 banking crisis. But Johnston was more than just a cooperative academic. Ed Mayo, his long-term friend and former Secretary of Co-ops UK, tells me that Johnston was also a talented musician, composer of music. And I look forward to listening to his music when Ed sends it to me. As Nick Matthews, the former chair of Cooperatives UK, said in his tribute last year to Johnston, there is no doubt that the UK movement has lost one of the great co-op advocates with the passing of Professor Johnston Birchall. Everyone who knew him and his work across the global cooperative movement will mourn his loss. Fortunately, he leaves a tremendous body of incredible, valuable work, as anyone looking through his dozens of publications will testify. But more than this, Johnston was simply a truly delightful person to be with and to work with. He was a dedicated cooperator with a clear personal commitment to our cooperative values and principles, which shone through his academic work grief at the death of such a delightful person never goes away. I pay tribute to him and renew our condolences to all his family and friends. In the preface to Co-op the People's Business, Johnston says that cooperation is as old as our human species. In support of this, he refers to a series of late 19th century and early 20th century essays, Mutual Aid, a Factor in Evolution, by the Russian evolutionary biologist Peter Kropotkin. Kropotkin, who examines the role of mutually beneficial cooperative behaviors in Darwin's theory of natural selection and the Darwinian struggle for existence. Johnston's reference to evolution in the preface of his seminal History of Our Movement immediately struck a chord with me when I was asked about whether I would present this lecture. During this cooperative fortnight, it is an aspect of co-ops that merits more detailed analysis, and to use the phrase we're using, unwrapping. It will help us understand co-ops and why we are cooperators. Citing the enormous impact of the Industrial Revolution, Johnston explains that the manufacturing revolution led to old forms of cooperation, which he said was with a small c, such as villages, tribes, clans, extended families, and medieval guilds breaking down, and new forms of cooperative developing. Some of these new forms failed, leading to renewed poverty and despair. But some survived and became part of the movement for cooperation with a large C. And as Johnston said, suddenly people were part of a conscious and deliberate cooperative movement. They had learned to be cooperators. But what makes a man like Johnston, indeed me, you, and a billion other cooperators around the world, discover and retain a lifelong commitment to cooperatives and cooperative enterprise as a better, more human way of doing business? What motivates us to be cooperators? Are our cooperative values and principles an expression of our humanity? Are these values attractive to us and others across the globe because they resonate with our very nature as conscious, cognizant beings? Is it an heritable part of our evolutionary heritage as social primates? I think these are key questions that merit unwrapping, as I have said. I should explain that before, as Ian told you, I became a cooperator and dedicated 40 years to cooperative housing. I qualified as a biology teacher with an enduring interest in evolutionary biology. This lecture takes Johnston's theme, cooperation as old as our human species, and explores the evolution of cooperation in our species, Homo sapiens. I do this in 6 sections. 1, understanding Darwin's theory of natural selection. 2, the attacks on Darwin's theory. 3, mutual aid as a factor in evolution and the inheritance of instinct. 4, the misinterpretation and misapplication of Darwin's theory to society and economics. 5, the origins of cooperation and virtue. And finally, 6, what an understanding of this means in practice for us as cooperators. Now, this gives me a lot of ground to cover in the hour, so I will crack on before Jane starts tapping her watch to tell me that time is up. Charles Darwin is my greatest scientific hero. Only Einstein and Galileo come close in my pantheon of scientific greats. I have a copy of the first edition of Darwin's On the Origin of Species that I reread once at least each year. I also endeavour to keep up to date with developments in evolutionary biology, genetics, and paleontology. I particularly like the books and essays of the late American evolutionary biologist and paleontologist Stephen Jay Gould that have advanced my understanding of the nature of biological evolution and the place of our species within it. In early 19th century Victorian England, the orthodox view of natural history and the origin of species was creationist. All species were uniquely created by God. Some natural historians considered the possibility of species with common characteristics being related by descent. But ideas about species evolving from a common ancestor were considered heretical. Darwin's genius was his patient observation, diligent experimentation, meticulous research, and deductive insights that led over many years to the formulation of his theory on the origin of species. Darwin's theory of evolution, or to give it its proper title, natural selection, was revolutionary. It ushered in a new epoch of scientific understanding. It changed fundamentally our understanding of life on Earth and our place within the natural world. According to Darwin, natural selection leads to the emergence of new species through a process he called descent with modification. It is descent with modification that is the source of the adaptive variations that create an advantage in the struggle for existence and reproductive success within what Darwin describes as the economy of nature. Now, there is no better way of summarizing Darwin's theory than his last sentence in The Origin. Darwin said, "There is grandeur in this view of life, with its several powers having been originally breathed into a few forms or into one, and that while this planet has gone cycling on according to the fixed laws of gravity, from so simple a beginning, endless forms, most beautiful and most wonderful, have been and are being evolved." After returning from his near 5-year voyage on HMS Beagle, during which he began to formulate his theory of natural selection, Darwin married Emma Wedgwood, his first cousin. With wealth inherited from his father and Emma's Wedgwood's famous Wedgwood pottery family, Darwin settled into life as a country gentleman at Down in Kent and devoted himself to a wide-ranging study of natural history. He had a particular interest in studying the breeding of varieties of domestic animals, particularly pigeons, that enabled him to develop and consolidate his theory of natural selection that began to take shape on his voyage on HMS Beagle. As a wealthy country gentleman, Darwin was a man of his time, subject to the political, social, and economic views and influences of Victorian England. There were two conflicting views of the causes of poverty among the working classes in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. The first was promulgated by the cleric and economist Thomas Malthus. The second by the French philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau. This was a debate between reactionary and radical socialist thought. Malthus's reactionary work, Essays in the Principles of Population, created an economics of scarcity and austerity that served to promote inequality and the defense of the landed gentry. The radical view came from Rousseau, who saw people in a state of nature as essentially good until corrupted by the unnaturalness of civilization. Rousseau's views fueled the French Revolution, leading to the landed class in England to fear a dual threat, an armed threat and an ideological one. Malthus provided the countering doctrine in defense of the status quo. Malthus saw little hope that the human race could overcome its natural tendency towards vice and the limits of nature. For Malthus, natural laws rule out equality, as some individuals are inevitably condemned to misery. According to Malthus, these unhappy souls have drawn a blank in the great lottery of life, and in no way does justice require that they receive an equal share of the produce of the earth. Malthus's view was that the population would always increase more rapidly than food supply, which could only increase in a straight line arithmetic rate. This meant that large numbers of people would always suffer from starvation and poverty. This pernicious view of human nature and the impossibility of society meeting the needs of all its citizens was influential in the establishment of the Poor Laws and in resisting the abolition of the Corn Laws that imposed tariffs on the import of grain to maintain the price of bread for the benefit of landowners at the expense of the poor. Malthus's views also helped fuel the abolition of outdoor parish poor relief and the establishment of harsh workhouses for the poor. Now, Malthus influenced Darwin. In his autobiography, Darwin wrote, "In October 1838, that is 15 months after I had begun my systematic inquiry, I happened to read for amusement Malthus on population. And being well prepared to appreciate the struggle for existence, which everywhere goes on from long continued observations of the habits of animals and plants, it at once struck me that under these circumstances, favorable variations would tend to be preserved and unfavorable ones to be destroyed. The result of this would be the formation of new species. Hence, here I had at last got a theory by which to work. But I was so anxious to avoid prejudice that I determined not for some time to write even the briefest sketch of it." At Down, Darwin continued his studies and experiments to refine his theory of natural selection. Realizing that its radical nature risked undermining the certainties of Victorian scientific, political and religious establishment, Darwin hesitated for over 20 years before he published his theory. He was finally prompted to publish when another biologist, Alfred Russel Wallace, wrote to Darwin setting out his similar view on natural selection as the origin of new species. Wallace asked Darwin if he considered it appropriate to send a copy of his letter to the eminent geologist Charles Lyell, who was a friend of Darwin. With advice from Lyell, Darwin was persuaded to allow a joint presentation of his theory with Wallace's, but with Darwin rightly claiming preeminence as first having articulated it in private writings. So it was that on the 1st of July, 1858, at the Linnean Society in London, a summary of the theory of natural selection was presented. Darwin's Origin, explaining the theory in greater detail, was published a year later in 1859. Darwin's theory turned the Victorian world and its sense of our place, of our species within it, upside down. It challenged the very nature of humanity. Darwin stating very cautiously that light will be thrown on the origin of man and his history. According to Darwin's theory, our species is the product of adaptive change over millions of years of descent with modification from the common ancestor of all species, not the unique creation made in the image of a benign deity that gave mankind dominion over the earth and all creation. You will note that I have resisted using the term evolution to describe Darwin's theory. This is because in his first edition of The Origin, Darwin did not use it. The closest he came was on the last page, in which he concludes his theory with the famous sentence I quoted above. In that sentence, he used the past tense, have evolved. There is a a serious, sound scientific reason for this. Evolution implies that natural selection has an inbuilt driver to greater complexity of life and the evolution of higher beings like us, with Homo sapiens as the pinnacle of that process. I am persuaded that there is no progressive driver in evolution. Stephen Jay Gould notes that evolution entered our language for what Darwin called descent with modification, because most Victorians equated such biological change with progress. And the word evolution, propelled into biology by the advocacy of Herbert Spencer, meant progress, literally meaning unfolding in the English vernacular. After long reflection, I cannot avoid the conviction that no innate tendency to progressive development exists. Humans are here by the luck of the draw, not by the inevitability of life's direction or evolution's mechanism. As Gould explains, life on Earth began at a unicellular left wall of simplicity, the only space open to natural selection and descent with modification is towards the right wall of greater complexity of a standard distribution curve. We are towards the long right tail of that distribution curve. If the history of life on Earth were to repeat itself, there could be no guarantee that complex, intelligent life would evolve. The modal form of life on Earth for the last 3.5 billion years is, was, and forever shall be bacterial. We also delude ourselves if we think that we are at the top branch of the evolutionary tree of life on Earth. Even within our mammalian order of primates, we are not the latest to evolve. Gorillas branched off the mammalian line first, then Homo species, including us, and finally, later in the evolutionary timescale, our cousins, the chimpanzees. Now that's a brief introduction to Darwin, but let us now look at the attacks on and defense of Darwin's theory of natural selection. Darwin's theory of natural selection shocked the Victorian world. Many from the church and the scientific establishment railed against this new view of humanity's place within nature. It undermined the certainty that God had placed white European males at the pinnacle of his creation. The idea that men and women of all races were descended from apes rather than uniquely God's special creations challenged Victorian society's fundamental view of human nature, its social norms, and the social hierarchy and inequality within it. The attacks on Darwin and his theory from all quarters of the religious, political, and scientific establishment were vociferous. With Darwin suffering repeated bouts of ill health, possibly from a parasitic infection acquired while on board the Beagle, and living in semi-seclusion at Down, it was others who publicly sprang to the defense of the theory. Prominent among these were the writer and Victorian philosopher Herbert Spencer, and the combative biologist and friend of Darwin's, Thomas Henry Huxley, often described as Darwin's bulldog. It was Herbert Spencer who coined the phrase survival of the fittest to describe natural selection. Darwin only used survival of the fittest in later editions of The Origin, at Wallace's suggestion to avoid readers thinking that the phrase natural selection personified nature as selecting. It was first used by Darwin in chapter 4 of the 5th edition of The Origin, published 10 years after his original publication date in 1869. Darwin's phrase, struggle for existence, was more nuanced. Darwin states quite clearly in The Origin, I should premise that I use struggle for existence in a large and metaphorical sense, including dependence of one being on another, and including, which is more important, not only the life of the individual, but success in leaving progeny. I now turn to mutual aid as a factor in evolution and the inheritance of instinct. It is clear from Darwin's more nuanced description of the struggle for existence that included that key phrase, including the dependence of one being upon another, that Darwin recognized that competition was not the only factor in natural selection. There are, in fact, many examples of mutually beneficial adaptive behaviors in the economy of nature. Darwin gives the classic example of the mutually beneficial farming of aphids by ants. Anyone like me who grows runner beans or broad beans will know that when ants are seen climbing up a bean stem, it is time to act against an aphid attack that will inevitably come. This is because the ants will be farming the aphids. They were farmers before we were. The aphids benefit from the protection of the ants, who hold their eggs in their nests over winter, and the ants benefit by stimulating the aphids with their antennae to excrete a sugary sap that feeds the ants. As Johnston Birchall explains in his preface to Co-op the People's Business, it was the radical Russian anarchist and former prince, Peter Kropotkin, who challenged the exclusive dominance of competition in the process of natural selection. In his collection of essays, published in 1902, Mutual Aid, a Factor in Evolution, Kropotkin gives numerous examples of mutual aid among animals. Kropotkin also documents the social lives of animals and shows how sociability leads to mutual aid benefits. He also explains how weather, habitat loss through climate change, and contagious diseases interact with natural selection. Quotation from Kropotkin, all tending to reduce the importance given to competition. Kropotkin concludes, the war of each against all is not the law of nature. Mutual aid is as much a law of nature as mutual struggle. Since Darwin and Kropotkin's time, our understanding that symbiotic and mutually beneficial behaviors are a factor in natural selection has grown. An integral part of our human nature, essential for our life on Earth, is the mutually beneficial action of bacteria in our gut that helps us digest food that feeds on what we call our gut flora. One of my favorite examples of mutual aid is the relationship between the greater honeyguide, an African bird that for millennia has led human hunter-gatherers to wild bee nests. This gives the hunter-gatherers access to energy-rich honey and enables the bird to eat the protein-rich bee larva, pupae, and wax. Present-day evolutionary biologists understand that within and between species, both competition and mutually beneficial behaviors play a part in the economy of nature. We know, for example, that fungi and trees, in what is now described as the wood wide web, benefit each other. The fungi, by breaking down and enabling the trees to access essential nutrients in the soil, sharing in return rich sugar sap from the tree. The fungal web also enables trees to share resources by making mycelial connections between their roots, particularly between mother trees and their younger offspring. There is also little evidence that direct competition between individuals, populations, and species has been a driving force in large genera such as reptiles, mollusks, and amphibians. These have flourished by adaptations that enable them to live in a wide range of habitats and have survived and thrived by finding what Stephen Jay Gould describes as their niche on the log of life. Also, it is wrong, as is so often done, to apply survival of the fittest to individuals and species. Natural selection works at the species level, not the level of the individual. It is through descent with modification of species through successive generations that beneficial adaptations and reproductive success operates. This understanding of mutually beneficial behaviors leads modern evolutionary biologists to avoid the phrase survival of the fittest, because competition is not the only factor in evolution, and it distorts Darwin's great insight. In an article entitled Kropotkin Was No Crackpot, Stephen Jay Gould admired Kropotkin's observations, noting that cooperation, if it increases individual survival, is not ruled out by natural selection and is in fact encouraged by it. The inheritance of instinct and its role in mutually beneficial behaviors is fascinating. It too is relevant to the subject of this lecture, the evolution of cooperation. In The Origin, Darwin devotes a whole chapter to the inheritance of instinct. Darwin shows that instincts too, like the adaptation of physical characteristics, are heritable and subject to the processes of natural selection and adaptive variation. He clearly describes instincts that are inherited rather than learned behaviors, giving as his principal example the most wonderful of all known instincts, that of the hive bee, said Darwin. The hive bee builds the most efficient hexagonal-shaped cells in which to store honey. He also explains how some instincts can be lost under domestication. For example, domestic chickens that do not sit to incubate their eggs being a prime example. Are mutually beneficial behaviors instincts that are inherited, like the instincts that lead bees to build honeycombs and birds to build their nests in a particular size and shape? Are they, as we would say today, written in the genes of the species rather than learned behaviors? These are key questions for us as cooperators. Darwin said that the instinct of each species is good for itself, but has never, as far as we can judge, been produced for the exclusive good of others. This may be true about mutual behaviors between different species, but there are certainly examples of altruistic behaviors that operate for the benefit of others within species and aid the survival of that species and reproductive success. A prime example is the sharing of blood meals by vampire bats when they come home to roost and find other members of their colony had not succeeded in feeding. This is a particularly interesting example because a bat will only share a blood meal with another in their colony who reciprocates and shares with them, a genuine cooperative form of behavior. I now turn to the two most egregious examples of the misrepresentation and misapplication of Darwin's theory of natural selection, both of which led to and continue to be the sources of the great economic and social injustices that plague us today: social Darwinism and biological determinism. Social Darwinism is the theory that individuals, groups, and peoples are subject to the same laws of natural selection as species. It has deep roots in the English philosophy that goes back to the Restoration philosopher Thomas Hobbes, who believed that people were basically greedy and selfish, and that human nature was fundamentally corrupt, engaged in that war of all against all. It was also influenced by the writing of Thomas Malthus and advocated by Herbert Spencer, aided by Thomas Henry Huxley, Darwin's bulldog. It was used, social Darwinism, to justify political conservatism, capital economic practices, imperialism, and racism, and to discourage political reform. It was only in the late 19th century that these extreme Spencerian views became known as social Darwinism. Spencer's extreme Malthuism predates Darwin. He clearly saw Darwin's theory of natural selection as a theory he could co-opt to support his theory of population deduced from the general law of animal fertility, which Spencer published in the Westminster Review in 1851. In Social Statistics, also published by Spencer in 1851, his treatise on social and political theory, Spencer showed a callous indifference towards the poor and the weak, describing the poor and weak as suffering from fatal non-adaptation, saying, and I quote him, that if they are sufficiently complete to live, they do live, and it is well that they should live. If they are not sufficiently complete to live, they die, and it is best that they should die. Spencer used Darwin to support his extreme social and Malthusian economic views. Hence, natural selection and descent with modification became survival of the fittest, and the concept of competition began ruthlessly to be applied to society by Spencer, Thomas Huxley, and others, and to economic policy rather than just to the origin of species, Darwin's original thesis. Spencer opposed taxation for any form of government intervention to alleviate the conditions of the poor, even opposing the construction of sewers to protect public health. Spencer was willing to permit the genetically weak and undeserving poor to live and die in abject poverty. This was a severe distortion and misapplication of Darwin's theory. Darwin did not wholly oppose Spencer's views. In The Defense of Man, Darwin's thesis is decidedly Malthusian. Although unlike Malthus, Spencer, and Huxley, Darwin's view was tinged with humanitarianism and empathy. For Darwin, the noblest part of human nature dictates sympathy for the inferior members of society. The bad effects of weak surviving and propagating their kind are to be borne without complaining. Jeff Wallace, in his introduction to the 1998 reprinted edition of The Origin, explores the trend of Darwin's theory being applied to society. In particular, he decries reading Darwin as if the text of The Origin embraces the free market, neoliberalism, and capital economic relations as more natural than others. Wallace questions the legitimacy of drawing with ease parallels between the natural and human world, and questions the trend from the 19th century to today of mapping Darwin's theories onto human behavior, whether individual or social behaviors. Wallace concludes that it seems undeniable that the tropes of new right managerialism, the streamlining and rationalization, in order to create leaner and fitter organizations capable of competing in a ruthless business world in which the strongest survive and the weakest go to the wall, have taken their coloring from natural selection, which will always succeed in reducing and saving every part of the organization as soon as it is superfluous. There is a direct link through a chain of political and social policy thinking between Spencer's extreme views and modern neoliberal capitalist thinkers like Friedrich Hayek. Hayek promoted laissez-faire capitalism and a libertarian economic system. in which individuals are able to pursue their self-interest with a minimum of direction from above, a philosophy so beloved of Reagan, Thatcher, and current right-wing politicians. Daily we see the social injustice, poverty, and distress, which my late friend and MP Tessa Jowell described as cowboy capitalism. It creates the growth of low-wage work, in-work poverty, and dependence on inadequate state welfare provision, the weakening of employment rights and the growth of the gig economy and zero-hour contracts, wages decreasing in real terms while executive pay soars, greater share of economic activity going to capital rather than to labor, housing and other assets in value beyond, inflating in value beyond the reach of middle-income households, with people in full-time work being dependent on housing benefit, which is really a subsidy to landlords, not to tenants. Increasing dependence on food banks, with NHS nurses forced to use them. Selfishness, lies, and cronyism eating away at the heart of our democracies, funded by the rich and powerful with dirty money. Increases in health inequalities and child poverty. An outsourcing of costs for the sake of profit, damaging the environment, exacerbating climate change, and the classic example being CO2 emissions, plastic pollution, and water companies discharging raw sewers into our rivers and seas. To understand fully these adverse economic outcomes of neoliberal laissez-faire capitalism, I recommend reading The Price of Inequality: How Today's Divided Society Endangers Our Future by Joseph E. Stiglitz, the Nobel Prize-winning economist and former economist at the World Bank. The extent of inequality in the UK has also been highlighted this week in the report Income Outcomes, published by the Resolution Foundation. The second most egregious misuse of Darwin is the deterministic hereditarian theory of human intelligence. This is a theory that intelligence is a defined and measurable reified thing that is determined through biological inheritance, with some races and the poor in society being less intelligent. They are therefore condemned to maintain a lower status and fewer rights in society and a lesser share in the benefits of economic activity. This, in combination with social Darwinism, is the origin of the persistent concept of the undeserving poor that drives right-wing political thinking on low taxes, the small state, cuts to education, social welfare, and the acceptability of income and wealth inequality that dominates neoliberal capitalist economics today. It was also the pernicious misapplication of Darwin that led to the development of eugenicist population theories and ultimately to racism and the Holocaust. To understand how pernicious and dangerous this ignorant and racist hereditarian theory of intelligence is, please search YouTube for the video of Boris Johnson's 2013 speech while he was Mayor of London, in which he uses blatantly this unscientific and discredited theory to justify inequalities in society as essential. There is no better critique of this pernicious, racist, anti-egalitarian theory than Stephen Jay Gould's majestic expose of its biological and evolutionary flaws in his book, The Mismeasure of Man. It is impossible to do justice to Gould's expose in this lecture, but I also highly commend his seminal book to you. It is important to us as cooperators because he explains why there is no justification in seeing inheritance as an heritable thing, a fixed attribute of every person that can be objectively measured, and which is not influenced by environment, education, poverty, or social disadvantage. Gould shows conclusively that all humanity shares a common evolutionary heritage, and that every person should be treated equally and without discrimination. His analysis resonates with our first non-discriminatory cooperative principle. Professor Steve Jones gives a fair summary of these hereditarian issues in his language of the genes, when he says that although genetics is about inheritance, inheritance is certainly not all about genetics. Nearly all inherited characteristics more complicated than a single change in the DNA involve gene and environment acting together. It is impossible to sort them into convenient compartments. An attribute such as intelligence is often seen as a cake which can be sliced into so much gene and so much environment. In fact, the two are so closely blended that trying to separate them is more like trying to unbake the cake. Failure to understand this simple biological fact leads to confusion and worse. I now turn to the origin of cooperation, having given you that very important background. Studying and understanding Darwin's wider metaphorical meaning in his theory of natural selection and descent with modification shows that our social species owes part of its success in the struggle for existence to our ability to work for common goals that are mutually beneficial. It provides clear evidence that the ability to recognize the needs of others and respond to them empathetically is a basic inherited human instinct. If a person has an accident or needs help, for example, a mother with a child in a pushchair facing a flight of steps, the most common response is for strangers immediately to offer assistance. A minority, of course, don't, for a variety of reasons, some understandable, some others for selfish reasons, but that does not detract from our common empathetic instinctive response. One of my favorite places where the nature of this instinct to help others is clearly shown is at the Postman's Park, a small park opposite the Museum of London by the Barbican in the City of London. In the middle of this small green space is a wall protected from the weather by a tiled roof with an open colonnade. On the wall are dozens of individually made ceramic tiles commemorating Londoners who gave their lives saving or attempting to save others. Even a dog is commemorated. It is a poignant reminder of our empathetic instincts. Kropotkin too extols courageous virtue, citing Royal National Lifeboat Institution crews who risked death to save others, and miners of the Rhondda Valley risking life and limb to save trapped colleagues. In the prologue of The Origins of Virtue, science writer, journalist, and now hereditary conservative peer, Matt Ridley, says that society was not invented by reasoning men. It evolved as part of our nature. It is much a product of our genes as our bodies are. To understand it, we must look inside our brains at the instincts for creating and exploiting social bonds that are there. We must also look at other animals to see how the essentially competitive business of evolution can sometimes give rise to cooperative instincts. Ridley analyzes the biological and anthropological origins of human ethical behavior. He points out that in The Selfish Gene, Richard Dawkins uses the prisoner's dilemma to show while individual cheats may prosper, on the whole, trusters do better than cheats and are therefore more likely to pass on their genes to the next generation. Ridley extends Dawkins' analysis to demonstrate how through game theory played on computers, mathematicians have shown that cooperative strategies produce greater benefits for the participants than selfish ones, providing the game is played more than once and defection from cooperation is punished. Ridley explains that the most effective game theory strategy to be devised is one called Firm But Fair, a program written by Marcus Freen of Cambridge University. Firm but fair cooperates with cooperators, is forgiving by returning to cooperation after defection by an opponent, rather than indulging in repeated discrimination, destroys free riders, the selfish hedonists who only look after their self-interest at the expense of others, and punishes suckers who do not retaliate when a defection from cooperation occurs. Given that human relationships mostly involve frequent and repeated interactions, cooperative strategies lead to the greatest benefits of all. The more casual and opportunistic encounters between individuals are, the less likely it is that cooperation will occur. This analysis of cooperative behaviors is supported by the work of others, in particular Robert Electrod in The Evolution of Cooperation, and the mathematician George Price, whose work and strategic short life story is told in The Price of Altruism. Encounters and interactions with others are beneficial and reciprocal, and they build trust. Trust is a tradable commodity. I trust him, he trusts you, so I can trust you. Trust is the currency of cooperation and the foundation of human virtue. And by cooperating, life becomes more than just a zero-sum game. The ability to use language is fundamental to our ability to cooperate. It enables us to formulate desired outcomes for our actions, to explain these to others and to agree or modify them in concert, and to adjust behavior through communication during mutual encounters. When communication breaks down, the first casualty is cooperation. The inability to cooperate effectively with others goes hand in hand with the inability to cooperate. I think this shows that our evolutionary past is not a Hobbesian war of all against all, or a Spencerian conflict in which the fittest survive and the devil of poverty, disease, and distress takes the hindmost. Our natural history and place in the economy of nature is much more complex than that. It is a complexity in which our instinct to avoid conflict and seek to cooperate for mutually beneficial outcomes has been and will be a vital part. To understand this interactive origin of human cooperation is not to fall into the deterministic trap of reifying cooperation as an inherited thing that can be assessed and measured. Whilst it is a manifestation of an inherited instinct, that instinct is a complex one that interacts with the physical and social environment in which we all function. But it does tell us that if we wish to achieve the best outcomes for all our citizens, we should build our institutions, our democracy, and our economy to be cooperative rather than ruthlessly competitive. Our cooperatives and the cooperative enterprises we build are exemplars of this. To understand this does not make us naive, nor does it remove or restrain the capacity of some members of our species to work with evil intent for their own selfish ends or perceived higher political purpose. How we behave in any situation, whether as hedonists, defectors, cooperators, or suckers, depends on our education, socialization, and the choices we make, as well as our genes. History is littered with examples of megalomaniacs who usurp and hold onto political and economic power and destroy the lives of others. Still emboldened, perhaps, by Spencerian social Darwinism. I could cite Boris Johnson, but I think that Putin and the unleashing of his immoral, unjust, aggressive, and destructive war in Ukraine is but the latest egregious example. As Peter Kropotkin said, one single war, we all know, may be productive of more evil, immediate and subsequent, than hundreds of years of unchecked action of the mutual aid principle may be productive of good. It is what worth noting what Stephen Jay Gould says about the development of human society. And I am close to the end, Jane. Thank you. Waving at me. Stephen Jay Gould said, using the same term evolution, but for both natural and cultural history, obfuscates more than it enlightens. Unfortunately, when we speak of cultural evolution, we unwittingly imply that this process shares essential similarity with the phenomenon most widely described by the same name, natural or Darwinian change. The obvious main difference between Darwinian evolution and cultural change lies in the enormous capacity that culture holds and nature lacks for explosive rapidity and cumulative directionality. In an unmeasurable blink of a geological eyelash, human cultural change has transformed the surface of our planet as no event of natural selection could ever accomplish at Darwinian scales of myriad generations. I now turn finally to the application of this and what this understanding means in practice to us as cooperators. Understanding the science behind the evolution of mutually beneficial behaviors gives us a firm, rational foundation for supporting and promoting cooperatives. But how we do this in practice to realize the development of cooperative commonwealth in which economic and social justice builds a better world and creates wealth for the many, not the few. How do we do this? Like Robert Owen, we reject the view of society that considers man to be responsible for his own character and condition of life. Owen's view was the polar opposite. In his autobiography, Owen said, "My own reflection compels me to come to very different conclusions. My reason taught me that I could not have made one of my own qualities. They were forced upon me by nature, that my language, religion, and habits were forced upon me by society, and that I was entirely the child of nature and society. That nature gave the qualities and society directed them." The Rochdale pioneers turned Owen's vision into practical reality. They and other early cooperative pioneers in other countries sought to build a cooperative commonwealth. We should follow their example by developing the cooperative economy in whatever way we can. Support for co-ops is not some wishful, pious, woke thinking. It is fundamentally in tune with nature, with what we are, and with what human societies should strive to be. I like to think that by supporting cooperative enterprise, we are like the worms tunneling under the foul dung heap of neoliberal capitalism, turning the economy into fertile soil for cooperation. I think this is an appropriate simile, given that the last book Darwin published before his death in 1881 was his research into the action of earthworms. We should be very practical in our endeavors. We should cooperate with a small c, with all those who are sympathetic to us, and support other organizations that strengthen democracy and civil society. We should also support and encourage the development of new forms of cooperative, such as housing, energy, and care cooperatives. Democratic participation in the life of cooperatives we are members of is vital. So is participation in sectoral national organizations and the International Cooperative Alliance. By participating, we should seek to ensure that our cooperatives are democratically accountable and comply with our cooperative values and principles. This is particularly important in our larger consumer cooperatives, so that they do not become what Kropotkin criticized as examples of joint stock individualism, which they are in danger of becoming if high-paid executives take control, or high-paid executive control takes precedence over member democracy. We also need to apply the fifth cooperative principle, using history and heritage to educate our members, the general public, our cooperative leaders and executives, politicians and young people to understand the principles and practices of cooperation. This requires us to be politically engaged. This is a challenging task, but we should recognize that the very survival of our species depends on it. I hope that I have unwrapped your thinking about the origin of cooperation and what makes us cooperators. Johnston Birchall too was a practical cooperator. In honouring Johnston's memory, we recognise that death too is an inevitable part of our evolutionary heritage. But I will leave you with a quote from Charles Darwin to help us understand why we must rise to this challenge. In his chapter on the evils of slavery in The Voyage of the Beagle, Darwin said, "If the misery of our poor be caused not by the laws of nature, but by our institutions, great is our sin." Thank you for listening to me.
Excellent, thank you for that. I'm sure everyone will agree that it was an enthralling tour de force, stitching together Darwin's origins with the origins of cooperation, but importantly with the analysis of modern day problems of the need for cooperation and how to build that cooperation and the cooperative movement nationally and internationally moving forward. And I'm sure that sparked plenty of interest and questions, and I'm sure people agree that in its history, in its thoroughness and in its practicality was a very fitting and full tribute in honour of Professor Johnston Birchall as well. So David, thank you for that, that was excellent.